Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us online for tonight's reading and conversation with Mai Al-Nakib and Noor Naga, celebrating an unlasting home and if an Egyptian cannot speak English. This event will be moderated by poet and former AAWW Margins Fellow, Ghinwa Jawhari. And we're so excited to have Mai, Noor, and Ghinwa online with us today. My name is Vandana Pala. I'm the programs coordinator at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. I'm speaking to you today from Brooklyn, New York, where I am on ancestral and unceded Canarsie and Munsee Lenape land. For those of you who are new to the Asian American Writers Workshop, we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian and Pacific diasporic literature and storytelling. We hold frequent readings and conversations like this one, organize community arts programming in New York City high schools and senior centers, run fellowship programs for emerging writers of color, and publish an award-winning online literary magazine, The Margins. I want to thank our amazing bookstore partners, Books Are Magic. You can purchase copies of Mai and Noor's books via the link in the description box, and you can support an awesome independent bookstore in doing so. You can find out more about us by visiting aaww.org or following us on Twitter, Instagram, and on our YouTube channel. We'll open our event with readings from An Unlasting Home and If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English, followed by a conversation. I'll briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll welcome Mai on screen to read. Mai Al-Nakib was born in Kuwait, but spent the first 6 years of her life in London, Edinburgh, and St. Louis, Missouri. She holds a PhD in English from Brown University and is an associate professor of English and comparative literature at Kuwait University. Her short story collection, The Hidden Light of Objects, was published by Bloomsbury, Qatar in 2014. It won the Edinburgh International Book Festival's 2014 First Book Award. Her stories and essays have been widely published, and she is a frequent contributor to World Literature Today and the BBC. Her debut novel, An Unlasting Home, is out from Mariner on April 12, 2022. Noor Naga is an Alexandrian writer and the author of a verse novel, Washes Praise. She is the winner of a Bronwyn Wallace Award and the RBC PEN Canada Award and the Disquiet Fiction Prize. She currently teaches at the American University in Cairo. Ghinwa Jawhari is the author of the chapbook Bint from 2021, winner of Radix Media's inaugural Own Voices Prize. Her essays, fiction, and poetry appear in Catapult, Mizna, The Margins, Narrative, and others. She is the 2021 Margins Fellow at the Asian American Writers Workshop. She was born to Drew's parents in Cleveland, Ohio, and is currently based in Brooklyn, New York. Please join me in welcoming Mai on screen to read.
Mohammed al-Batlan, Hanan's father, my new lawyer, is standing in front of the building, a black brick monstrosity in the middle of Kuwait City, when the police pull up. He is tall and wide as an elephant. Mine is not the first blasphemy case, it seems, so he knows where to find me. I'm in the habit of flipping through the daily papers, so how I missed this development, I'm not sure. But if I'm honest, I've kept myself removed for so long, my ignorance is no great mystery. Mr. al-Batlan booms instructions at me as the gray officers, diminished in the face of my lawyer's presence, lead me up the stairs and through the glass doors. Don't answer any questions. A student recorded one of your lectures. A member of parliament has raised a case. Sarah, pay attention to what I'm saying. Not a word. Do you hear me? I have a hard time following any of it, but I hold on to his last words. You'll be out tomorrow morning. The small, filthy cell in the women's section of the building is beautiful in its way, covered with words in many languages: Arabic, Urdu, Tagalog, Malayalam, French, Hindi, English. The three walls, the low ceiling, the floor, even the toilet, every inch of space etched with words, messages from one woman to another or to someone far away. I try to recollect the faces of all the students I taught during the spring semester. 3 all-girls classes, 20 students per class, 60 students total. I think of them sitting in the circle I make them arrange themselves into so that we can discuss things more equally. It doesn't quite work the way it did at Berkeley, but I persist, hoping the circle will make them brave. My accuser had to be in my 8 o'clock intro to Phil class, a freshman offended to learn not everyone believes the same truth. I go around the circle in my mind, trying to pinpoint faces, to remember names. The girls in their hijab and niqab blend together. It's bigoted of me to think so, but they're hard to tell apart. I can't single anyone out. I give up on my class and turn to the walls of the cell. Poems, laments, prayers to God, cries for mothers. Please, Ma, save me. I feel cradled by thousands of writing hands, their fear blending with mine, outsiders in a closed country. They were here before me. How many were deported home? I have nowhere to be deported to, and yet their words of longing lull me, allowing me to drift into pockets of sleep. Mr. Al-Batin comes to collect me the next morning. I sign some sort of pledge and am released on my own recognizance. He drives me home and stays for tea. The dainty love seat gives off dust the instant he sits on it. The formal sala has been neglected for months. A recording was made by one of your students, Mr. Al-Batin tells me. On the recording, you were heard stating that God is dead. A student handed the recording to the most conservative member of parliament. The Salafi MP, on behalf of the student, has lodged a complaint against you. The public prosecution has filed a case. You're being accused of blasphemy under the new law, designating it a capital crime. He pauses. Thankfully, the law has provisions. You may be allowed to retract before the trial even begins. But if you're found guilty, and I assure you that would be a highly improbable outcome, execution is not guaranteed. My blood freezes. Even if all appeals are overturned, you should be allowed to retract your blasphemous statement before the final judge, and that could influence the punishment. He makes little curly signs in the air with his forefingers for scare quotes. Derrida made the sign for scare quotes exactly the same way in a lecture he gave at Berkeley. Derrida and Berkeley are deserts apart from Mr. Al-Batin and Kuwait, but unexpectedly in this gesture, they aren't. I focus on Mr. Al-Batin's statements. I don't like the sound of the words should and could. In that case, the sentence would likely be commuted to 5 years in prison and a 10,000 dinar fine. I don't like the sound of the word likely. He pauses again, an elephant with its eyes shut. In the meantime, as the case proceeds, and these cases can go on for years, you're not permitted to leave the country. You're free to work and you will be paid. Apart from travel, you can do whatever you please. Mr. Al-Batin winks at me incongruously. I stare back in shock as he continues, within the bounds of the law. I've been living with this accusation for 7 days, a week like a lifetime. Maria doesn't know. It'll kill her with her heart of stents and scars. I tell Asif and beg him not to share the news. Asif, a man of integrity, will remain chup-chop. He closes his eyes and tilts his chin upward, hides the newspapers from Maria, my face plastered on the front pages. Unable to sleep, I've been holding vigil with Bibi Mittu beside his cage on the landing of the stairs. Bibi Mittu, Mama Lulua's African gray parrot, keeps a trace of my grandmother alive. She brought Bibi Mittu back from India almost 60 years ago. Mama Lulua never wanted to return to Kuwait, but she didn't have a choice. Nobody made me come back, and now I couldn't leave if I wanted to. So here I am, unlikely caretaker of an ancient parrot, accidental collector of fading traces, stuck in place.
Hello, hello. I'm going to be reading a section from the first part, and the only thing that you really need to know is that it's written in 2 voices, and this is the male speaker, and then I'll read from the female speaker in the next section. Question: does furniture recognize, or does it make, a stranger in the house? So this is how she lives. The first night I went up to see her balconies and I didn't see them.
I couldn't see anything but her small face and shiver body. Only when she left the next day for work was I able to examine the place at leisure. Her apartment is in one of the older buildings in downtown Cairo, a corner unit on the 7th floor with high ceilings and classical trimmings on all the balustrades. But the inside is insane, furnished with what she refers to as pieces, cleans hand-woven by Fayoumi Bedouins, bookshelves that smell of wintered linseed oil, hardbacks in English and German, which, when opened, reveal ribbons and leaves pressed into their hearts, an enormous steel water filter with a piece of coal inside it, an antique French canapé, orchids that she feeds with an eyedropper and hides in a room I am not allowed to smoke in, a stool with 3 red legs in a slab of unfinished concrete, a gurgling air purifier, a phonograph, a seamstress bust draped in pearls. The tables and chairs are all arranged as though for a portrait, at their best angles, with haughty upturned chins and arched foot soles. She leaves the shutters open day and night to display them to the world. The only mess she allows herself is littering the floor with her clothes, the silk dress she wore a week ago, still a puddle in the corner of the bedroom. But otherwise, the space is intentional, sensorial. She tells me the apartment was rented furnished from a distant relative, an academic who lives most of the year in Berlin. But even if this is true, enough of it is her own. She belongs to this apartment as much as I don't. It reminds me of the places the foreigners used to stay in 2011, which were always equally perverse. You'd walk in and be confronted immediately with the feeling that all the furniture was living in denial of its geographic circumstance, that the human who had done the arrangements was afraid of the city outside her windows. But in the American girl's apartment, she is perfectly comfortable, and I am the one slinking around the room like a thief, unsure where to sit or where to go. She comes and goes to work, and I stay in this apartment that could be anywhere in the world if it weren't for the balconies and me in it. Question: can home be passed from one body to the next, like a secret whispered in the ear? He tells me that in Shubrachit they never call a woman by her name in the street, least of all a mother. He tells me it's no one's business outside the family. If I want to call out to my cousin, I use her husband's name. If I want to call out to my mother, I use my own name and she looks up. I ask him how he used to call out to his grandmother, and he says, I wouldn't need to call, I'd be by her side. Is this why he doesn't like it when I go out alone? I always assumed he was jealous, but could it be protectiveness instead? When we are on the street, he moves naturally between my body and the traffic. He plucks my purse off my outer shoulder and rehangs it on my inner shoulder, where motorcyclists whizzing past cannot snatch it. Around every corner, he expects a criminal, but everything is always fine. We are wizards together, a bald woman and a long-haired man in fantastic dragon clothes. All we need is a leashed monkey and some sort of instrument. We walk the streets and everyone ogles us. If he disappears into a store for a minute, everyone is whistling, hollering, hissing, he tricked you, honey, and now he's wearing your hair. Is your cunt as clean? I could like that. He comes back out and hasn't heard any of this, but he's seething as though he had, expects it somehow, stomps his sandaled socks and walks like a tantrum. Later, he points out scenes from the revolution as if proving his machismo to me, threading pearls around my neck. Aziz, that was the Brotherhoods. Everyone in there bearded, Quran playing day and night. The kids wiped it out with Molotovs. Now look, no beards, and they have music playing like a normal restaurant. This store sold gas masks, that one gunpowder. There was a woman on the 3rd floor of that building who used to throw bottles of vinegar and bags of yeast to us from her balcony, both being antidotes to tear gas. Pepsi also works. This is where Subhi heard a bullet with his ear. It went in the left and out the right. That is the apartment Al Jazeera used to film The Square from. Aren't you lucky to be here with me? Who else could tell you these things? No one will tell you these things. He was right. Who else could get me up to speed? After so many lifetimes of peaceful eating, a nation overturns the dinner table. There is the darling outrage, a newfound entitlement, hope, yes, hope, and then betrayal, disillusionment, that sheepishness afterward at having been caught believing. For every Egyptian of my generation, this will be the greatest political event of their lives, the drama they return to and repeat to their children and to their children's children to explain the world they are born into. I missed it entirely. Watched the revolution on television from the comfort of my home on the Upper West Side, a French bulldog on my lap. How convenient then, when all is said and done, to arrive in the riskless aftermath, claiming, me too, I'm one of you. I'm too late returning, and he knows it. As long as we are outside on the streets in the city that he owns, he leverages his knowledge against me. When we come home, he is less powerful, less instructive. But why do I say home as though he lived here? Does he? He came up one night, slipped my dress over my head and never left. We've been playing house for the last 2 weeks, except that I'm both father and mother, bringing home the meat and also cooking it, while he waits for me with his cheek in his hand. Do I mind? It's nice to crash into his chest when he opens the front door. He hears the elevator and comes to meet me before I can finish turning the key in the lock. I used to shower and go out after work, to Rish or the bars in Zamalek. But now we stay in more and more. It's getting cooler. We run hot water over our bodies and he soaps the day off my skin, kisses the top of my scalp. We make love everywhere. I have more than enough food to share. We eat by the light of a Siwan salt lamp. He asked once if there was a spare key and I said I would make him a copy, but I don't. Thanks.
In both of your novels, the past continues to hold a notable stake in the present. In particular, the characters carry the weight of not only their own family histories, but the histories of countries that are ravaged and hollowed by colonizing interests and revolutions. May, in an Unlasting Home, your speaker, Sarah, states, as we place objects in boxes to give away, we realize that the vibrancy of our past doesn't exist in accumulated furniture or knickknacks, it exists in us. And Noor, in If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English, your approach to the past is similarly reflected in characters who seem to tend to their pasts like wounds. I found this especially striking when the boy from Shubrahit mentions his grandmother or the revolution. He states, I was in the square every day documenting what we were already calling revolution, and the world was all eyes. Cairo was flooded with foreigners. My question is, can you talk more about the intersections of the characters' personal pasts and the political histories of their regions? How did the past inform the work? And further, what happens when the past isn't reckoned with?
I mean, I can just sort of begin loosely talking about, for me, the sense of this novel. So I knew that it was going to be a multi-generational story about women. I didn't know exactly how it was going to proceed. And it started with Lulu and Yasmin. And then Sara, because this law was passed in Kuwait in 2013, the Sara story came after I started writing the Lulu and Yasmin stories, which were moving. I wrote them moving back and forth. I didn't know how they would intersect, but I had a sense that they would. And then the 2013 blasphemy law was passed in Kuwait, and then the Sara story came to me really, and I started writing that. And then I had a sense that this would be the protagonist, and her life would then connect back to these other women that I was already writing about. So immediately there was a sense for me that this life of the protagonist, Sara, was going to be layered with the stories of these other women. And that was a way for me to connect her life to the lives of these women, this multi-generational story. And for Sara, it very much becomes about reckoning with that past, her generational past, her own. I mean, Sara is very much stalled in her life, and she returns back to Kuwait, not really knowing exactly what it is that she's coming back for. But she gets drawn back. I won't kind of spoil with the reasons why, but she gets pulled back to Kuwait, and almost it's almost something that happens to her, that she starts collecting these stories and these layers and kind of realizing that the lives of these women who shaped her have really culminated in her own experience. And the way that I put the story together in terms of its form, Sara's story sandwiched between her grandmothers and then between Maria's and her mother Noura's, is a way to kind of give a sense that their pasts are mirrored in hers. And then there's the additional layer of Kuwait. And then Sara again begins to realize that this place that she so wanted to avoid her whole life, she wanted to leave it behind. And then when she does leave, arrives in the US and has what looks like a great life, it's not quite enough. And that there's still the sense that she needs to reconcile something about herself with the history of her country. And it was only in through doing that that she finds a path out for herself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck, especially in comparison to May's book, which is so intergenerational and reaches so far back. You know, I think that with my own novel, the characters are much more sort of circling around this the revolution in particular, and having experienced it on opposite sides of the Atlantic, they obviously have very different relationships to it. So in the boys' case, you know, this was really a wonderful moment, not just on a national level, but also personally for him, because it provided him with sort of employment opportunities and a real sense of validation in himself. His work was suddenly important on an international scale. And this is something that he'd been sort of struggling with, having come from a small village in the provinces, you know, not being actually from the capital, not having any social capital in this space. You know, his family does not come from wealth. He doesn't really belong in this place. And so it sort of provides him an opportunity to really strut his nationalism and be useful to his country in that moment. And so, you know, consequently, when all of the foreigners leave and Egypt is taken out of the spotlight and the revolution turns out to have been a sort of giant disappointment, you know, the general sentiment among many young Egyptians, especially those who cannot leave, is one of sort of frustration and defeat. But even more so if you are someone who comes from poverty, who had their heyday in the revolution, and now you're kind of living in the decline of that and with a drug addiction and things like that. So so he's really, you know, at the lowest point in his life. And then this girl comes in, and her relationship is different because she's got all of that. She's got sort of an Egyptian complex. Am I Egyptian enough? You know, she's sort of this American girl basically, but she's never been to Egypt, but she claims Egyptianness. And she watched it on TV, and she feels like she arrived a little bit too late. And so so they both end up in this perfect situation to abuse each other because they need something from the other. So in her case, she's sort of using him as an access point to this social history that she missed out on, this on the ground kind of play-by-play of what actually happened in downtown where she's staying. And for him, he's using her for a way out, actually. Almost like an anchor or like a fisheye to sort of look out into the world that he can't access for all kinds of reasons that have been exacerbated in the last sort of decade since the revolution. So lots of Egyptian youth feel trapped. It's very difficult to get even a tourist visa to leave. So yeah, so I think that they have sort of opposite complexes that provide the perfect opportunity for abuse.
Yeah, this is also perfect. You touched on things that that are like in the other question, so it's like a good segue. So this is actually in the list. It's number 7. Noor, staying with you. I like the nod to bodily identity that the American girl provides. She states, after years of claiming Arabness as an excuse for what I am, hairy, hard-boned, and dirt-skinned, sensual, impulsive, superstitious, nostalgic, full of body shame and estrangement, I feel I'm earning it at last. The hazing is belated, but confusingly sweet. And May, your character's sense of Arabness is fragmented across nations and generations. Notably, when Noura says that she wants to stay in the US to pursue her doctorate, her husband disagrees with her. He says, we don't belong here. And her father, Mubarak, also laments the move from India to Kuwait to her privately. So we see May's Sarah struggling to piece together her mother's life in Kuwait, or Noor's American struggling in Egypt. And the question is, identity seems to rest in the core of these struggles. So can you both talk about what earning an Arab identity or earning a national identity entails? And additionally, how does identity inform the character's relationship to their respective country or countries?
I think, in a sense, this, my book is in many ways about this confrontation or sort of the struggle between belonging and not belonging for all the characters in one way or another. They're moving around. It's very much about migratory passage, movement, whether they're forced to leave or whether they choose to leave. There's the sense that they can't really land on home. And I think that they may be looking for it, but I think there is also a sense in the novel where non-belonging becomes something that they also find productive, or I don't know if empowering is the right word, but it is something that seems to benefit them in one way or another. So for example, Sheikha as a character doesn't have to stay with her brutal husband. I think at one point I say something like, the people of the town would have sided with her, but she stays. There's a kind of stubborn, almost perverse need to stay in that location of not belonging. I think for Maria as well, that making the decision to move herself and to accept this space of not belonging allows her to make a better life for her children, if not for herself. At least she tries to do that. And I think for Sada as well, where she tries to kind of, I'm not sure how much Sada is looking for belonging. She's looking for something, but I'm not sure that it is belonging. I think, in fact, at the end, it's Sada's understanding that she is not going to belong here. It's making her peace with the fact that she's not going to belong here. And in fact, that's the lesson learned through the gathering of the stories of her grandmothers, Maria and Noura, that not belonging is also an acceptable modality, and that she shouldn't be afraid to move out of this desire, or if she's looking for home, it's almost like it's almost like a kind of imperative. You have to find your home, you have to find your identity, you have to find your place. But in fact, I think for me, the sense that comes out of this novel is that no, you don't. And in fact, there might be all these various forces that will push against you ever landing or finding that space of belonging.
So well put. Yeah, it's interesting thinking about how different these books are. But in the case of my novel, I was much more interested in sort of contemporary American PC culture. So I was thinking a lot about the ways in which identity can be weaponized, particularly minority identity, if you are queer or if you are Arab, how it can be sort of capitalized on and used as a kind of armor or even a weapon in these cultures that are sort of largely antagonistic to these minority groups, but sort of on an individual level, the way that people can take advantage of them, can play up certain features. So with the American girl, she comes from some kind of wealth. Her parents are very comfortable. She might be an immigrant, but she is not facing the same kinds of challenges that might be associated with an immigrant. And so she's very much in at least at university, she plays up her Egyptianness as much as she can. She is exoticizing herself. She even sort of takes on the mantle of queerness by shaving her head, although she's quite straight. So she's playing on the edge of passing, and because of her sort of positionality, people are unable to call her out and say, well, this is kind of a problem. And she's also in a context where a lot of people don't know enough about her to sort of really pin her down and say, well, you can't actually claim this kind of privilege, this kind of oppression. And so all of this kind of becomes becomes a more heightened issue when she goes to Egypt, because her relationship to the space is almost one of like desiring a kind of punishment. So she gets stuck into this abusive relationship with this man. It's mutually abusive, but I mean, he's definitely harmful to her. But a lot of that has to do with almost, a desire to prove that she is from this place because she's been claiming it her whole life. And so she sort of allows for violence done against her and almost relishes in it. It's sort of, she becomes sort of confused about to what extent their relationship dynamic is just part and parcel of what it means to be an Egyptian woman. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I feel that. Yeah, and that was, I guess also what made it difficult to read sometimes, because there was so many moments in both of your books actually where I was like, I wanted to like scream and be like, no, don't go there. So I have a question that's not on the list, but just since we're talking about it, I'm really curious if there were any sections that were difficult to write or characters that you didn't really like writing towards. Noor, I'm thinking about Sami and Reem talking about Saad Hosni at the cafe, and like her not knowing who Saad Hosni is, and that like kind of moment where you see her for kind of like not knowing anything about the culture, kind of like having it not necessarily go over her head because she is curious and she does want to learn, but something that's like very classically Egyptian just like missing. And May, for yours as well, like there was a nod very much to like labor in Kuwait, like foreign labor, like Maria's family. And you did her like this incredible service of including her story within, like folding it within the novel. And Sarah in multiple points says like, I know I feel bad, I'm taking her from her kids. And we get the background for that, which I found must have been a challenge to write or include in a way that was done extremely well, like without kind of the, I don't want to say the vantage point of privilege, but kind of. So I would love for you guys to talk about not even just that section, if any section was difficult, and how you kind of, I guess, as writers pulled through that difficulty and were able to write.
So the difficult part for me was Sada just wanting to kind of shake Sada into action, that was the hardest thing for me. It's like, why is it taking her so long to just sort of do the things that she has to do? Why is she so hung up on Nabil for so long? It almost doesn't make sense. Why is she so paralyzed? This person who did have so much privilege. She had so many opportunities, great education. Her mother made sure she was educated. Off she goes. The world is her oyster. And yet she's so stalled, and then even the return back. And so that was hard for me to write, although I had to kind of put myself in a sense in her shoes and the shoes of the kind of trauma that Sada went through. It takes 10 years, it takes 11 years sometimes to work through those issues, and so it took her that long. In terms of the Maria section, so for me, it was really important for Maria is the emotional center for me of the book. And in terms of the relationship with the kids, Sada and Karim, Maria is the heart of their emotional life, that the kind of distance, because the parents don't offer the kids the kind of emotional center that they need. And so Maria is that for them. And it was important for me to represent the domestic carers that are underrepresented in Kuwait, but I think in places beyond Kuwait too, the intimate relationships that develop between the children and their carers, their caregivers, but also the background, the incredible sacrifices that happen that don't get seen necessarily. And all of that for me was really important. And because Maria was as important to shaping Sada as any, and more important, I think, in many ways, it was important for me to relay that story in exactly the same way as the people that Sada was related to. It was equally significant. She was her second mother. So I felt that had to be told in the same way as Noura's story was conveyed.
Yeah, I think in terms of my own novel, I was more concerned with maintaining a balance as much as possible between these two characters. I don't have such a wealth of characters as Mai does. It's primarily kind of two, and you occasionally get these sort of more minor characters that act as sort of doubles or foils. Um, but in terms of kind of the boy from Shubrachit and the American girl, my biggest concern was how to keep the sympathy as even as possible. I didn't want it to be too obvious who you should be siding with. I wanted to really complicate each of their positions as much as possible. And so sort of my favorite thing to do is to ask people afterwards, you know, who did you empathize more with? And it often tells me a lot more about their own positionality. So people who are closer in sort of position to the American girl tend to be much harder on her actually, and tend to say, well, she is, you know, this voice of empire coming into the novel, and she is sort of violent in all these ways, and she exploited him and took his story and ran off. Whereas when I talk to Egyptians who are born and raised in Egypt and don't have that kind of complex, they tend to side with her more, and tend to be harder on this guy and say, well, who is this guy? He sounds like a dick anyway. So that's been really interesting to me, to sort of see, you know, how people's own loyalties get sort of divided throughout the novel, and to try as much as possible to even it out. So most of the sort of finer tweaks with regards to kind of insider outsider status had to do really with making very tiny adjustments to maintain a balance.
Yeah, I felt that, and it was I'm impressed with it as well, because you do a really good job writing both. You all do. I was like for the last few weeks, these were like a treat for me. I have a question that I wrote originally with Mai in mind, but it applies, I guess, to both of you. It's number 9 on the list. Mai, one quote that stuck with me from your book was, "Populations end up with the governments they deserve." And that was coming from Sada, I think, right before her trial, or it was like right at this very anxious and nervous time where she was knowing that kind of like she was going to be at the mercy of the state, wasn't sure which way it was going to go. And I would love to hear more about like not only what informs this quote. I'm Lebanese, so we all kind of like come from like these governments where we maybe not necessarily claim them, or don't claim obviously sections of them that have kind of allowed for unsuccessful revolutions, or violence against women or minorities, et cetera, et cetera. So I would love to hear more just what informed this, like not only in the writing of An Unlasting Home, but your experiences. I think you're both in your respective, I know Mai, you're in Kuwait, and Noor, you're in Egypt. So yeah, I'm curious about like the reflection of this quote, I guess.
And when Sada says that, she's also very aware that she would get in trouble for saying that if she were back at Berkeley, right? So that she says, you know, I would get in trouble for that. But I think from Sada's point of view, you know, coming back to Kuwait when she did, and teaching in the context of Kuwait University, things becoming much more conservative after the invasion and liberation of Kuwait, and being surrounded by all of this is the majority population, so that the parliament, in fact, represents the population of the country at the time, and still today, you know, in Kuwait, more or less. So the demographic in Kuwait, for a wide variety of complex reasons, has changed a great deal since after the, it was building up, but definitely after liberation, the demographic changed, because for many reasons, partly to do with the expulsion of the Palestinians, the Palestinian population in Kuwait, also because of the rise in Bedouin nationalization, you know, giving nationality to not the Bedouin, I'm sorry, the Bedouin population. The Bedouin is a whole other problem, that is the stateless, not given citizenship. But again, that change in demographic is what Sada is witnessing. You know, those are her students. That's the parliament that passed this law. And I felt, you know, I think that it's a difficult thing to say, given exactly for the reasons that you mentioned, that many in the population fight and struggle, and, you know, revolutions come and go, and people are working. Women's groups work, you know, for the, you know, the transformation of laws and status of women and their rights and all of that. At the same time, you know, the parliament that we end up with does seem to represent the majority, you know, and it's an awful situation to be in. And it makes it feel very disheartening. And for Sara, at the end, she gives up, right? She says, I'm leaving it to the Wasmiyas, you know, and it is a female student that presents this accusation against her. And so Sara, as much as she tries, it's not her place anymore, in a sense. So I'm not sure I 100% agree with Sara. You know, I think that we, in part, perhaps it's true, but on the other hand, there's just so much power, and it's so intensified and such, you know, in not in the hands of the majorities. And in those instances, it isn't fair, you know, and it isn't representative of the majority. So I think I'm kind of with Sara. I can see her point of view, but on the other hand, and especially, you know, writ large across the region, it doesn't always apply.
Yeah, I think I had a similar feeling when I read that line, because it is coming in a particular context from a particular character's mouth. And you can understand why she feels that way and why, to some extent, it would apply in Kuwait. But of course, you know, it's very difficult to sort of blame the Syrian population for the government they have, or the Egyptian, you know, it's very difficult to know what you would need to go back and change to not end up with the outcome that you have today. And I think that's part and parcel. I think it's partly why there's so much sort of grief in the region, is because at least in Egypt, there is so much grief and so much disillusionment, political disillusionment and political disengagement, and a real sense of, you know, it's not even easy to know where to point the fingers. There's so many fingers that you need. And it's, you know, we're a population of 100 million. And so, yeah, it's too difficult.
Too many cooks in the kitchen, I think, is what we, Lebanon is nowhere near the size of Egypt, and we have the same problem. I was like very aware of love in both of your pieces. And Mai, like love, especially for you, you have like Sara's love for Nabil being like very deep and nostalgic, and like it's a childhood friend. And I don't want to ruin too much of like kind of what happens after. And then Noor, obviously like your, I guess, lust, power and abuse, but there was also some love there, I think. And whether it showed up kind of for the American as like a feeling of obligation or protectiveness possibly from the boys' end. So the question says, love appears in both of your novels as sacrifice and obligation. I'm also thinking, Mai, of Maria's love for her children, which is entrenched with fear and responsibility. And Noor, I'm thinking of the American's pity on the boy from Shubra Khait towards the end of the novel, where she slips money into his pockets, and even though the relationship is over and they're not together anymore. So love can appear also as passion and lust and possession, but in either case, it's always high risk. So can you talk about which loves felt central to you while writing your pieces, or anything that you want to say about kind of like the role of love in the work?
So Nabil and Sara felt, you know, that felt central to the story and to Sara's sense of who she is. In a way, her relationship with Nabil is, you know, she has this intense relationship with her brother, Karim, and Nabil becomes this kind of figure between the two of them. And so there is that as well. There's something about her relationship with Nabil that also carries something of her brother with it. But Nabil stands for lots of things, I think, for Sara. Her sense of internal exile, her sense of her, you know, fraught relationship with Kuwait is something that is mirrored in Nabil. But there's also in Nabil the sense of wildness, or the sense that he's going to escape, or he has this plan, this sense, this way out. And there's a kind of excitement, I think, with Nabil that Sarah is obviously drawn to. So there's all of that, but also the baggage, or I don't know, it may not be the baggage necessarily, but the shared history of growing up in that bubble that they grew up in, a kind of Kuwait that Tariq, her father, is really loyal to, but her mother is not at all loyal to. I think there's some of that in her clinging on to Nabil long after she should have let him go, I think. I think the other element of love, I mean, the love between the family members, mothers, daughters, all of that is certainly there. But I think what's interesting too for Sada is her relationship with Carl. I found intriguing because that what holds them together is this shared experience of violence. And that is something that's so intense. I think he can't find his way out of that experience except through her. And I think he also becomes her way out of her experience of trauma and violence, in a way that they find that in each other, and that it makes sense. It makes sense for them to see something in each other, and a way out, I think, in each other. And I found that interesting to write. For me, it was interesting. And it's interesting also that he's from Norway. So that parallel between Kuwait and Norway as oil producing nations, I found satisfying.
Yeah, well, there's only one sort of love story really in this novel, and I don't know to what extent. I was actually very curious if people would think of it as a love affair, or feel that there was a real warmth between these characters, because there's such a web of kind of ulterior motives at all times, and there is a lot of there's a lot of pity on the part of the girl in the direction of the boy. There's also a lot of nostalgia, so she's very much kind of reenacting a childhood relationship with her father through this person, her father being the only real sort of male figure who speaks Arabic that has been in her life. And so there's a kind of slight doubling happening there, although well, yeah, and then also on the part of the boy, he's sort of hung up with grief over the death of his grandmother, who was sort of the only real love in his life, and this is one of those, actually it's a minor love, but maybe this is sort of the purest or most extreme, perhaps even most fanatical form of love that appears in the novel, although it's kind of tangential. But he's sort of constantly looking for a replacement, and he has these ideas about what that will look like. And loyalty is very much at the forefront, which is what sort of dooms his relationship with the girl in the end. But yeah, it is a sort of complex. Love is not simple, I think, at all in this novel. It's very much sort of braided with guilt and pity and nostalgia and almost hatred at times, like a kind of punishment, a desire to punish or a desire to be punished. So it's complicated.
Okay, so I'd like to end on kind of like the question or the characterization of like female freedom or female empowerment. I read both of the novels as kind of like a female empowerment kind of novel anyway. Maybe that's just my lens when I read things in general. I'm just like, oh, like good for her, like, So Mai, even though, and for several of your characters, you mentioned Shaikha, but also like Lulwa to an extent, who kind of gets entrapped with like the guilt of being there for her mother, and Maria also kind of being not forced, but has to kind of move and do all of these jobs. Like, I felt like despite the fact that they were like willing captives, like they had to be in these places, it was still their strength that kind of pulled them through. It was still the fact that they could do these things. And the end result is Sara. It's somebody who's highly educated, can teach at a university, despite getting like tried for blasphemy, has the opportunity to be in that position where she is, I guess, accused. And Noor, obviously for you, like I read my initial thing with the American was like you said, like somebody who's closer to her positionality kind of doesn't feel for her the same way. Maybe not dislikes her, but it's kind of like, oh, I know one of those, like maybe it's me, right? Like maybe it's this internal person who you're like, But I also, it can be read very much like her positionality, again, can be read very much as like, she's free to shave her head. She's free to go get an apartment in Cairo. She's living there by herself. She has a really nice apartment. She has money. She has a job, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just curious, like what, talk about like female freedom in the novel, what it meant for you, if it was kind of if at any point you kind of like, you know, restructured something because you felt like, oh, well, I don't want to talk about this, or I want to show this instead. And yeah, I'm curious about that. And we can end on that. That's a good place to end, I think.
So I do really think that, although I didn't start out with the sense that that's what I was doing, or this is what Sada's trajectory was going to be about. But as it turns out, in many ways, it is a novel about Sada making her way toward her own freedom, trying to figure out what that might mean. So as you said, she's very privileged in so many ways. And it is the sacrifices of these other women that made that privilege possible for her. But she, I don't think, had worked through what exactly she can do with that free, you know, or with that privilege, with the opportunities. And I think that the women that shaped her, you know, the grandmothers, the great grandmothers, I think that while they were sometimes willing captives and sometimes just made captive by the forces of patriarchy that really controls so, you know, their lives and the directions their lives have to take. Like even Lulwa, who's married to a lovely man, has to come back to Kuwait. Noura, who loves her husband, but has this real ambition and desire to do, you know, to take part in politics. And she has a sense of who she is and who she wants to be. And that's curtailed and she's brought back. Maria, you know, brave, goes off into the world, but it's the circumstances that force her to do those things. And I think despite all of that, they practice a kind of freedom, a formidable sort of sense of perseverance and push, I think, that makes Sada's path, let's say, she has to discover it. She has to uncover what they've done in a sense, and then it makes her path toward freedom more possible, you know, and she begins to see it and all of that. So I think it became important for me that Sada finds her way out, you know, that's something that built up through the other characters and their way toward that empowerment.
Yeah, you know, it's a really interesting question. I sort of feel I don't feel so precious about the American girl's sense of freedom. I think you know, she has a lot of freedom in Cairo because of her class. You know, the amount of money that she has, and also because she sort of is actually read as a foreigner. So the kind of social policing that she is subject to is far less than it would be if she was read as a local. If it was sort of known who her family is and where they live, it would be difficult. So sort of she's also sort of blissfully unaware. She kind of moves through this world feeling invincible, feeling safe, and really without good reason. I mean, she can be harmed, and she's sort of oblivious to it. And so, you know, in relation to the boy, he's got a different kind of power. He might not have any money or any social standing. He might have addiction problems and no employment and all these sort of things. But he's also, he's got a sort of masculine privilege, and he's able to kind of move through Cairo in a way that she wouldn't be able to. He's able to live on the street, and she would not be able to do that. Sort of sleeping in mosques and things like that. So he's got a kind of, he's got a mobility within the city, and particularly within downtown, which he feels a claim to, whereas she has a kind of international mobility and an ability to flee at any moment. So this feeling of kind of entrapment that is so common to Egyptians in Egypt, especially sort of working classes. She doesn't have that. So they each have a kind of different kind of power, but it wasn't so important for me to kind of have her victorious over the patriarchy or anything like that. I think, yeah, I think these things are complicated.
especially when you bring in, like you said, like a local woman would not be viewed the same way, would not have that mobility. True for you also, May, as well. Thank you guys both. I think we have like 2 more seconds, so I'm just gonna like gush some more. Everybody should read these books. I'm like really excited to see just Arab American experiences in general, like be at the heart of both books. And I very much enjoyed reading them. So thank you for making them, putting them out into the world.
Thank you for reading. And I adored Noor's book. So I'm so happy to have, you know, been part of this with Noor, because it was just such a great read. I loved it.
Likewise, I wanted to say I grew up in Dubai and I'm so familiar with the Gulf, and this is like a shocking book, absolutely shocking. It's actually the first of its kind. I've like been pseudo studying this for years, and there are no Anglophone novels about the Gulf that go back this far. Like it's actually a very new phenomenon, Aslan, but like the way that this kind of reaches all the way back into the 19th century, it's like incredible. And like the amount of research you must have done to get away with this. I mean, I was just really, really, really impressed, May, and I hope that this becomes, and I know that it will become like a classic in Gulf literature. So I'm really excited.
Thank you so much, Noor. That means a lot
Cool.
to me. Thank you.
I learned so much, May. So thank you. I like, these were things that I had and I'm like, every time I'm reading, I'm like, oh my God, and I'm like going on Wikipedia and like learning more. So it was for both of you. And I love the footnotes, Noor. Also, I had to mention that the reference to Alimbi, I was like cracking up. I'm like, oh my gosh. Well, thank you guys.
Also, Ghinwa, thanks for all the great questions.
Yeah,
it's
you're
very
welcome.
difficult to like, I was wondering, how's she going to tie these books together? They're so different, but you did so well.
It was a process.
You did
Thank
an
you.
amazing job. Thank you for that. Really, really.
Yeah.
Enjoyed the conversation with you guys so much. Yeah.